All right, welcome back. I hope you had a good break this afternoon. I am hoping that we will be able to finish the study of Revelation 13, verses 1 through 10. We have about 12 pages in our syllabus that we need to finish within this hour. And then in our next session tomorrow, we will be studying about the second beast of Revelation chapter 13, the beast that rises from the earth. That's the equivalent to Revelation 12:17, where the dragon is enraged with the woman. In Revelation 13, it's the beast that comes up from the earth that speaks like a dragon. So basically, Revelation 13:11 to 18 is an amplification of Revelation 12:17, where it speaks about the dragon being enraged with the woman and going to make war against her. Now, I believe that last time we were at the subtitle, Paul's Mysterious Restrainer, if I'm not mistaken. You remember that we mentioned that as long as the civil power was ruling in Rome, the papacy was what? Chained, restrained. But when the ruler or the emperor was taken out of the way, in other words, went to Constantinople, and the last emperor was deposed, what happened? The chains fell off, because now the Pope becomes not only the ruler in the ecclesiastical aspect, but also in the civil aspect. Was that clear? Now, the Apostle Paul spoke about this. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 has the same basic idea. So let's notice this at the bottom of the page. In cryptic language, the Apostle Paul had already referred to the moment when the civil power of the Roman Empire would be given over to papal Rome. In 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 6 and 7, the apostle referred to the removal of the mysterious restrainer. Incidentally, we don't have enough time to study everything concerning 2 Thessalonians 2. But the good news is that at the end of your syllabus, you have a long exposition of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So you'll be able to read it. Also, we already taped it. We have a 2-hour presentation on 2 Thessalonians 2. So we're only going to touch upon certain aspects of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So notice what the Apostle Paul had to say in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verses 6 and 7. Here he says this, and now you know what? In the Greek, that is a neuter. You know, in English, we have masculine and feminine. In Greek, you have a neuter, which is neither feminine nor masculine. So he says, and now you know what is what? Restraining. Was something restraining in the days of Paul? Something was restraining. But now notice it continues saying, and now you know what is restraining, that he, that is the papacy, may be revealed in his own time. Now, when is the time that the papacy was going to be revealed? From 538 to what? To 1798. That was the time when it was going to be revealed. And then it continues, the Apostle Paul continues saying, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only he, now the he is what? Masculine pronoun, so it's referring to an individual. Before it was referring to the system. Now it's referring to an individual. It says only he who now restrains will do so until he is what? Until he is taken out of the way. So what I want you to see is that in the days of Paul, the man of sin could not manifest himself because something was what? Was restraining him, a person, and also a system, because the neuter and the masculine are used. But something was going to happen that was going to remove the restrainer, and then the man of sin would reveal himself. Are you following this? Now, let's continue. The early church fathers were practically unanimous in the opinion that the restrainer was a reference to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in general, but the emperors in particular. See, there's where you have the neuter and you have the masculine. In verse 5, the Apostle Paul refers to what was restraining, using the neuter article to katechon. By his use of language, Paul indicates that the church at Thessalonica, let me just go a little bit earlier, I skipped something. In verse 5, the Apostle refers to what was restraining, using the neuter article to katechon, but in verse 7, he refers to who was restraining, using the masculine article ho katechon. By his use of language, Paul indicates that the church at Thessalonica knew who the restrainer was and what was restraining. Did they know that? Did they know that something and someone was restraining? The Apostle Paul says so. And yet Paul wrote in veiled, cryptic language. Why didn't Paul just come out and say, hey, the restrainer is the Roman Empire, and when the restrainer is taken out of the way, then the man of sin is going to reveal himself? Well, the answer is quite obvious. If Paul had said openly that the Roman Empire was going to be taken out of the way, he would be accused of sedition against the Roman Empire. And so Paul had to be cautious. He says, you know who I'm talking about, but he doesn't explicitly say who it is. Now, dispensationalists and some Adventists, including the Andrews University Seminary Bible, which is a very good Bible, by the way, but they got it wrong on their note on 2 Thessalonians 2. But many evangelical scholars, they describe the restrainer as the Holy Spirit. But if this were true, why would the Apostle Paul not just come out and say so? That would not have been a revolutionary statement. It is clear that Paul could not define the restrainer openly. It was not necessary to do so because the Thessalonians knew already what he was talking about. It will be noticed that in Cardinal Manning's remark, which we read before, remember we read that in our last session? The fall of the Roman Empire led to the what? To the liberation of the Roman pontiff. So was he restrained? Yes. That is to say, before taking over the reins of civil power, the pontiff was restrained, or in what? Chains. Remember chains? Was in captivity, so to speak. Thus the fall of the Roman Empire and the removal of the emperor, which allowed the papacy to take the reins of civil power, is described by Manning as what? As the chains falling off the hands of the successor of Peter. The inevitable conclusion that we can reach from Manning's own words is that the fall of the empire removed the restraints of the secular power from the Bishop of Rome so that he could ascend to civil power. Are you understanding this? Now, let's notice what the early church fathers had to say. Several of them measured in on this. The first would be Tertullian. He lived between 160 and 240 AD. This is how he expressed it. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hinders must hinder until he be taken out of the way. And then he asked this question: what obstacle is there but the Roman state, the falling away of which, by being scattered into 10 kingdoms, shall introduce Antichrist upon its own ruins? So did he understand this? You better believe he did. And then shall be revealed the wicked one. Now, also Tertullian wrote the following: the very end of all things, threatening dreadful woes, is only retarded by the continued existence of the Roman Empire. Are you understanding what he's saying? The Roman Empire was what? Restraining the manifestation of the man of sin. Another individual who wrote was Lactantius. Early in the 4th century, he wrote this: the subject itself declares that the fall and ruin of the world will shortly take place, except that while the city of Rome remains, it appears that nothing of this kind is to be feared. But when that capital of the world shall have fallen, and shall have begun to be a street, which the Sibyls say shall come to pass, who can doubt that the end has now arrived to the affairs of men in the whole world? It is that city, that only, which still sustains all things. Did they understand that something very significant would happen when the civil power of Rome was removed? Yeah. Absolutely. Notice what Cyril of Jerusalem had to say. He lived between 318 and 386 AD. But this aforesaid Christ is to come when the times of the Roman Empire shall have been fulfilled, and the end of the world is drawing near. Of course, they felt that the Antichrist would bring immediately the end of the world. They were wrong in that regard, but they were right that when the empire was divided, the Antichrist would come. They just didn't see that there were going to be two stages to the Antichrist. He continues writing, there shall rise up together 10 kings of the Romans, reigning in different parts perhaps, but all about the same time. And after those, an 11th, the Antichrist, who by his magical craft shall seize upon the Roman power. So is this power going to take over the civil reins of government? Yes. He shall seize upon the Roman power, and of the kings who reigned before him. 3 he shall humble, and the remaining 7 he shall keep in subjection to himself. And this is before it happened. Notice what Ambrose had to say. He died in the year 398 AD. After the falling or decay of the Roman Empire, Antichrist shall appear. Chrysostom, who died in the year 407 AD, said when the Roman Empire is taken out of the way, he's referring to Paul, isn't he? Then the Antichrist shall come. And naturally, for as long as the fear of this empire lasts, no one will willingly exalt himself. But when that is dissolved, when the empire is dissolved, he will attack the anarchy and endeavor to seize upon the government, both of whom? Of man and God. That means church and what? Church and state. Notice what Jerome had to say. He died in the year 420 AD. He that letteth, this is good King James language, he that letteth, that means restrains, is taken out of the way. Because the barbarian invasions were already taking place. And he could see that the Roman Empire was falling. So he says, he that letteth is taken out of the way, and yet we do not realize that Antichrist is what? Near. Did he recognize that when the kingdom was divided into several different kingdoms that the Antichrist would arise? Yeah, they were living at that time. So they could write this way. Now, I want you to notice what other Roman Catholic theologians had to say about this. This is James P. Conroy, Roman Catholic, by the way. He's writing in the American Catholic Quarterly Review, and that's very interesting what he says. Long ages ago, when Rome, through the neglect of the Western emperors, was left to the mercy of the barbarous hordes, the Romans turned to one figure for aid and protection and asked him to rule them. And thus, in this simple manner, the best title of all to kingly right commenced the temporal sovereignty of the popes. And meekly stepping to the throne of Caesar, the vicar of Christ took up the scepter to which the emperors and kings of Europe were to bow in reverence through so many ages. What an amazing statement by a Roman Catholic. He doesn't realize that he's commenting on 2 Thessalonians 2. But we know that he is. Now here's another one. Roman Catholic, also Karl Conrad Eckhart, in his book, The Papacy and World Affairs, speaks of 3 stages. Remember we said that the papacy has 4 stages? Well, he mentions not the papacy, but the 4th beast. He mentions 3 of those, but he doesn't realize that he's commenting on Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 12. This is how he states it. Under the Roman Empire, that would be stage number 1, right? The popes had no temporal powers. Why didn't the popes have temporal powers under the Roman Empire? Because there was an emperor. But when the Roman Empire had disintegrated, what stage is that? That's stage number 2, isn't it? That's when Rome is divided. It says, but when the Roman Empire had disintegrated and its place had been taken by a number of rude, barbarous kingdoms, those are the 10 horns. Now comes number 3, the Roman Catholic Church not only became independent of the states in religious affairs, but dominated secular affairs as well. Stage number 3. The historians corroborate what we find in Scripture. R.W. Southern has something very interesting to say. He says, during the whole medieval period, there was in Rome a single spiritual and temporal authority, exercising powers which in the end exceeded those that had ever lain within the grasp of the Roman emperor. In other words, the little horn was greater, wasn't it? It says in Daniel chapter 7, and this historian is saying that. Church historian John N. Figi had an interesting way of expressing this. He says, in the Middle Ages, the church was not a state, it was the state. Or rather, now he explains, or rather the civil authority for a separate society was not recognized, was merely the police department of the church. Are you catching the picture? The state is the police department of the church. So whatever the church says, the state does. Here's another one. By the way, this is Pope Boniface the Eighth, who in the year 1302 proclaimed a bull. A bull is a papal letter. The word bull doesn't mean the same as it does in English. But anyway, it's a personal letter that the Pope is writing here. And notice what he wrote about the power of the papacy. He said, we are informed by the texts of the Gospels that in this church, this Roman Catholic Church, and in its power are two swords. Now, he starts on the wrong track. Namely, the spiritual and the temporal. Is the Pope saying that the Pope has both swords and both the right to rule in the church and in the state? Yes. Now, both, therefore, are in the power of the church. That is to say, the spiritual and the material sword. But the former, that is the spiritual, is to be administered for the church, but the latter, the temporal, by the church. The former is in the hands of the priest, that is the spiritual sword. The latter by the hands of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. It's interesting how historians, they don't catch the connection with Bible prophecy, but when we read it in the light of Bible prophecy, it makes perfect sense. Now, notice what Ellen White said about the restrainer. Ellen White understood that the restrainer was the civil power. Notice this first statement where she talks about the early Christian church during the period when the Roman Empire was still ruling. She says the spirit of compromise and conformity of the early Christian church was what? That's the key word. Was restrained. What was restrained? Who restrained? Was restrained for a time by the fierce persecutions which the church endured under paganism. When Ellen White speaks about paganism, she's talking about the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. So what was it that was restraining the manifestation of the Antichrist? It was the paganism or the Roman Empire. And then she continues saying, but as persecution ceased, that is, as the Roman Empire ceased its persecution of Christians, and Christianity entered the courts and palaces of kings, she laid aside the humble simplicity of Christ and his apostles for the pomp and pride of pagan priests and rulers, and in place of the requirements of God, she substituted human theories and traditions. And then I want you to notice this very interesting statement that she makes about the future. This statement that I'm going to read is Great Controversy, page 564. And notice the key words once again. Let the restraints now imposed by secular governments. Who imposes the restraints? Is that what imposed the restraints upon the manifestation of the Antichrist in the early church? Yes. Let the restraints now imposed by secular governments be what? That's the removal of the restrainer. But in the second stage of the papacy, she says, be removed, and Rome be what? Oh, did this happen once before? Yeah. Was the secular power removed and the papacy allowed to rule in the past? Yes. Is it going to happen again when the deadly wound is healed? Absolutely. So she says, let the restraints now imposed by secular governments be removed, and Rome be reinstated in her former power, and there would speedily be a revival. What does revival mean? You can't revive that which hasn't died. It has a deadly wound. And there would speedily, she says, be a revival of her tyranny and persecution. So what is it what is the one thing that is lacking for persecution to come? The one thing that is lacking is for the civil power to lend itself again to the use of the papacy. And that is taking place today in the world. One further statement, Manuscript Releases, Volume 1, page 50. Ellen White says, the vast empire of Rome crumbled to pieces, and from its ruins rose that mighty power, the Roman Catholic Church. This church boasts of her infallibility and her hereditary religion. So are you understanding this restrainer part? See, does it have to do with church and state? See, we started with the idea of the feet of the image of Daniel 2. Because that is foundational to all, it's foundational to 2 Thessalonians 2. It's foundational to Revelation 13. It's foundational to every prophecy about the papacy. We'll see also in Daniel 11, it says, arms shall stand in its behalf. In other words, arms is the strength of the secular power will come and help the papacy, help the king of the north. It's in every single one of the prophecies, this idea of the union of church and state. Praise God, we still live in a country where church and state are separate. And let me say this, the civil powers of the world need to have it very clear in their minds, they should not dabble with the papacy. Because the papacy, what it wants, is it wants the restraint of the civil power to be removed so it can control the world the way it did in the past. Now, let's talk about the deadly wound and the captivity. Revelation 20 helps us understand what it means for the man of sin to be bound and unbound. See, the book of Revelation explains what the binding and unbinding of the Antichrist is, or the man of sin is, or restrained and unrestrained. When Satan was able to influence the kings of the earth to accomplish his purposes before the millennium, he was what? He was free and unbound, right? But what happens at the beginning of the millennium? A powerful angel descends from heaven, and what does he have in his hand? He has a chain in his hand, and what is he going to do? He's going to throw Satan into what? Into prison, into captivity. Now, what does that mean? It's very simple. What's going to happen with all of the kings that the devil used before the second coming of Christ? They're all going to die. So is the devil going to have any support on the part of the kings of the earth? No. So what's happening with him? He is what? He's bound. As long as he's able to use the kings, he's loose. When the help of the kings is removed because they're dead, he's bound. Are you with me? Now, thus we are to understand the captivity of the beast of Revelation 13, verse 10. When the beast could use the sword of the kings to accomplish its purposes, it was free. But when the kings removed the sword, it was what? In captivity. Thus, the captivity mentioned in Revelation 13, verse 10, does not refer merely to Pope Pius VI. Does it? No. It is the beast that goes into captivity, the whole system. Why? Because the kings of the earth, what? Remove their support, and they don't support the system anymore. So now the system is captive again, which is the same thing as saying that the system has a deadly wound and cannot function as long as it doesn't have the support of what? Of the state. Now, bottom of the page, Revelation 13, verse 10 states explicitly that the very sword that the papacy used to kill God's people would be used by the state to give the papacy its deadly wound. This means that in 1798, the secular power would use its sword to give the papacy a deadly wound and to throw it into captivity. Has the papacy been captive the last 200 plus years? Why? Because all sorts of democratic governments have appeared on the scene. They proclaim their emancipation from this system, but they have forgotten history. And it's very dangerous to forget history, because if you do, you are in danger of repeating it. A careful study of Revelation 13, verse 10, reveals that the deadly wound does not refer primarily to the confiscation of the territories of the Roman Catholic Church. Neither is it the elimination of the Roman Catholic Church as a church, because that never happened. Let me ask you, in 1798, were the Roman Catholic churches still open after that? Sure. Did people still take their kids to get baptized? Sure. Did people still go to the confessional to confess their sins? Did people still partake of the host in the communion service? Yeah. Is the deadly wound into the Catholic Church is going to cease to exist? No. What does it mean? Well, let's notice. The deadly wound was given to the papacy when the sword of the state that the papacy had used to persecute God's people turned against it. The deadly wound then was the removal of the sword of the state from the hand of the papacy. This led the papacy into what? Into captivity, because it could no longer use the power of the state to enforce its practices and dogmas. It was forced into inactivity by the very power that had brought it into activity. The year 1798 marked the climax of the French Revolution that began in 1789. The revolution was an uprising against kingly power and priestly intolerance. On February 12, 1798, General Berthier entered Vatican City, actually to the Sistine Chapel, where the Pope was celebrating the anniversary of his coronation, and he deposed him from his throne, removed his triple crown, informed him that his power was at an end, and took him prisoner to France, where he died in exile in 1799. The Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, had already given orders that a new pope could not be elected. But in a little while, he would change his mind. We're going to notice the reason why. Now let's read how historians describe the deadly wound. See, people misunderstand what the word papacy means. The word papacy does not mean the Roman Catholic Church as a church. The word papacy means the system that unites church and state. The deadly wound is the separation of the power of the state from the church. The deadly wound means that the church can no longer use the power of the state, because the state said no more. Now, let's notice how historians describe the deadly wound. This is one statement by George Trevor. Speaking about what happened in the French Revolution, the papacy was extinct. Was the Roman Catholic Church extinct? No, the papacy was extinct. Not a vestige of its existence remained. The church still remained, but he understands papacy as the union of church and state. He continues saying, and this is very unusual. What would have happened during the Middle Ages if some nation had arisen against the papacy? All of the other nations would gang up on that nation to defend the papacy. But now notice what happens. And among all the Roman Catholic powers, not a finger was stirred in its defense, because it no longer had the support of the state, by the way. The Eternal City had no longer prince or pontiff. Its bishop was a dying captive in foreign lands, and the decree was already announced that no successor would be allowed in its place. Here's another description. Joseph Rickaby, in his book Lectures on the History of Religion, stated, "No wonder that half of Europe thought Napoleon's veto means that he said there's not going to be any more popes elected. No wonder that half of Europe thought Napoleon's veto would be obeyed, and that with the Pope, the papacy was dead." Interesting. Does that have any relationship with the deadly wound? The papacy was dead, according to half of Europe. Here's another one, T.H. Gill, The Papal Drama, Book 10. Multitudes imagined that the papacy was at the point of death. These are secular historians. And asked, would Pius VI be the last pontiff, and if the close of the 18th century would be signalized by the fall of the papal dynasty. And one more quotation. This is quoted in the book Symposium on Revelation. The papacy had suffered its deepest humiliation and appeared to be what? Annihilated. The papacy, not the Roman Catholic Church. The revolution also dealt it the wound, this is a secular historian, had dealt it the wound which it seemed did not want to heal until far into the 20th century. Interesting quotations from the historian. So are you understanding what the deadly wound of the papacy is? It's the papacy and Roman Catholic Church are two different things. Let me say tell you something. The church aspect deceives the multitudes of the world. But the state aspect controls the great thinkers of the world. In other words, the church aspect of Roman Catholicism is what is meant to deceive the masses. But the state part is where the power of the papacy resides. Now let's go to the section, the eldest daughter. One can't help but sense the irony of what took place in 1798. France is known as the eldest daughter of the papacy. Some people say the eldest son of the papacy. We might say the eldest child of the papacy to please both groups. Because Clovis, king of the Franks, was the first to officially give temporal power to the papacy in the year 508. Strikingly, the very nation that had first given the papacy the sword now turned against her mother, giving her the deadly wound. In the chapter on the French Revolution, Ellen White quoted the church historian Wiley concerning the meaning of the sword. See, Ellen White understood what the sword is. It's not the Bible. Notice, thus Rome succeeded in arraying France against the Reformation. It was to uphold the throne, preserve the nobles, and maintain the laws that what? That the sword of persecution was first unsheathed in France. So who has the sword? The civil powers of France. And France was the first persecutor. And it's also the power that took away the power from the papacy. Luther understood the meaning of the sword. When he was about to depart for the Wartburg, back from the Wartburg back to Wittenberg, he spoke the following words to the Elector of Saxony. No secular sword can advance this cause. God must do all, without the aid or cooperation of man. He who has most faith is the most availing defense. So did Luther understand that there's another meaning to the sword? Secular sword, he calls it. And interestingly enough, Ellen White also understood that the sword refers to the secular power. In speaking of Saul of Tarsus, she said, then he was entrusted with the sword of secular power. What does that mean, that Saul was entrusted with the sword of secular power? Saul recruited the political system to get rid of the Christians. So once again, he was entrusted with the sword of the secular power. And notice these words that are used. He was the agent of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish inquisitor, the exterminator of heretics. Those expressions are used by Ellen White to describe the papacy. Seeking victims to imprison, to scourge, or to stone. Did the apostate church in the days of Christ do the same thing as the apostate church during the 1260 years? Recruit the secular power to persecute? Absolutely. Now, next section, catastrophic event. The French Revolution was a catastrophic event for the papacy. In the aftermath of the revolution, country after country in the Western world followed the example of France and the United States, establishing democratic governments or Republican-style governments that proclaimed their emancipation from the papacy's dominion. And now notice this. Once again, Henry Manning, he doesn't realize that he's commenting on prophecy, but it helps us. The helplessness of the papacy is revealed in a book written by Cardinal Edward Manning and published in 1862, where he rebukes the nations of Europe for forsaking the papacy. Is that interesting? Was it only France that forsook the papacy? Oh, no, no, no. Cardinal Manning is saying, look at all of Europe has forsaken the papacy, because all of the other countries said, hey, we like what France did. The United States said, hey, France was a good thing. You know, the United States has a lot of links with what happened in the French Revolution. Now, notice what he had to say. See this Catholic Church, this Church of God, feeble and weak, rejected even by the very nations called Catholic. There is Catholic France, and Catholic Germany, and Catholic Italy, giving up this exploded figment of the temporal power of the vicar of Jesus Christ. They're giving up the idea that the vicar of Christ can have temporal power. And so, because the church seems weak, and the vicar of the Son of God is renewing the passion of his master upon earth, therefore we are scandalized. Therefore we turn our faces from him. What were the nations of Europe doing? They were turning their faces from the papacy. You see, it was not only France. France began the process, a process that led all of the nations of Europe to proclaim their emancipation from the power of the papacy, and also the United States of America. Ranko Stefanovic, who wrote a massive commentary in the book of Revelation, had this to say about the French Revolution. The events of the French Revolution, including the demise of the papacy under Napoleon, that impacted politics and religious liberty, are probably the most apparent manifestation of the mortal wound. But for all practical purposes, it was this long process of political, social, and religious transformation that caused the mortal wound and brought the sea beast to the is not period. You know, this is related to Revelation 17. It speaks about a beast that was, is not, and will be. Is that related to what we're studying in Revelation 13? You can't disconnect Revelation 17 from Revelation 13. Was 1,260 years, is not because it has a deadly wound, and will come up from the abyss, which is the grave, because it's going to resurrect to power again. Revelation 17, it needs to be connected with Revelation chapter 13. Now let's talk about the healing of the wound. Are we doing well so far? Are you able to follow me? Okay, the healing of the wound. But while the revolution dealt the papacy a devastating death blow, prophecy foretells that she will arise from her deathbed far more powerful and despotic than she was in the past. Revelation 13 verse 3 tells us that the mortal wound would be healed, and the whole world would marvel and follow after the beast. What is the healing of the papacy's deadly wound? Is it primarily the restoration of her confiscated territory by the Italian government? Is it the recovery of her ecclesiastical power? No. Only by knowing what is meant by the deadly wound can we understand what its healing is. Let me ask you this. If the deadly wound means that the sword is taken away from the papacy and is used to give the papacy a deadly wound, and she's sent into captivity because the secular power now says, we are going to rule, we're not going to allow you to rule through us, what would be the healing of the deadly wound? It would have to mean that the papacy once again would recover the sword, and the secular power would support her, and she would be free again. That's the healing of the wound. Has that taken place yet? No, but it's well on its way. We must understand that papacy is a code word for a religious political system that employs the power of the state to compel people to obey its dictates. Expressed another way, the papacy is not merely a church, but an amalgamation of church and state. It is a political power that presents before the world a religious face. With its religious face, it deceives the multitudes, and with its political seat, it enters the great political centers of the world. If the deadly wound means that in 1798 the state turned against the papacy and took away the sword, then the healing of the wound must mean that the state will once more support her and give her the sword back and release her from captivity. Now let's answer the question, was the deadly wound healed in 1801? Well, you say 1801, what's that all about? Well, let's notice. It is a little known fact in Adventist circles that a new pope was elected just 3.5 years after the deadly wound was given. Not only was a new pope elected, but he was also allowed to retain possession of his Italian principality. In other words, he still had his see. Says historian Arthur Robert Pennington, Napoleon felt that as the large majority of the inhabitants of France knew no other form of faith than Romanism, it must become the established religion of the country. One of the big mistakes that Napoleon made, by the way. Accordingly, we find that he now began negotiations with the Pope, which issued in a concordat in July of 1801, whereby the Roman Catholic religion was once more established in France. He also left Pius in possession of his Italian principality. He still had the power of the state, didn't he? The Pope. So you say, well, if that happened in 1801, why don't we believe that the healing of the deadly wound took place in 1801? There are 4 reasons. Number 1, prophecy tells us that the wound will be healed by the United States, not France. Point number 2, no nation in Europe wanted anything to do with the papacy. So you can't say that its wound was healed in 1801 when all the nations are declaring their independence from the papacy. Point number 3, an image of the beast was not made after this. And the mark of the beast was not enforced on pain of death. And the Bible tells us that when the wound is healed, that is what is going to happen. And finally, number 4, the power of the papacy was severely restricted by the French government. The state elected the bishops and paid the clergy, and the clergy were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the state. So the tables were somewhat turned on the papacy. So was the wound healed in 1801? Absolutely not. Now, another fact that is not known very commonly in Adventist circles is the wound that was given in the year 1870. In 1870, the papacy received a further wound. Let's go through the story of how it happened. Another little known fact in Adventist circles is that the papacy received a further wound on September 20, 1870, when King Victor Emmanuel II confiscated the papal states. You see, Italy used to be a whole bunch of like little countries. Tuscany and, all these Lombardia and all these Lombardy, all of these were like little countries. But they were under the leadership of the Pope. But they each had their own local government. And so Victor Emmanuel II confiscated the papal states and united Italy into one country. As a result, the papacy lost most of its territory, except for a handful of buildings in Vatican City. In protest, Pope Pius IX and his successors declared themselves prisoners of the Vatican. And as a result, no pope left Vatican City for the next 59 years. During his pontificate of 46 years, Pope Pius IX further alienated and angered governments of Western Europe and the United States by proclaiming the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, by publishing his syllabus of errors where he railed against a Republican style of government, religious liberty, and the idea that the Roman Catholic Church is not the true church. I mean, this was a document that was despised even by the countries in Europe. And he railed against democratic governments and civil and religious liberty. And by calling Vatican Council I, where it was proclaimed that the Pope, when he speaks on faith and morals, is infallible. That went over like a lead balloon with the countries in Europe and with the United States. Now, another question that comes up is whether the deadly wound was healed in 1929. Adventist writers and evangelists have made much of the year 1929, when the government of Italy signed a concordat with the Vatican, thus healing the wound that had been inflicted by the Italian government in 1870. But was the deadly wound of 1798 healed in 1929. There are several convincing reasons why we cannot say that the wound was healed in 1929. And now I'm going to give you those reasons. Number one, the wound that was healed in 1929 was not the one that was given in 1798. It was the one that was given in 1870. The Concordat had to do with 1870. It did not have to do with 1798. I'm going to show you that in a few moments. Secondly, the prophecy of Revelation 13, 11 to 18 tells us that it is the United States that will heal the wound, the beast that rises from the earth, and not Italy. Even more significantly, after 1929, the world did not marvel after the beast. Neither was the image of the beast raised up, nor the mark of the beast imposed. Are you following me? And so the wound, I might be willing to say that the wound began the process of healing, but the wound was not healed at that time. So where does the idea come from in the Adventist Church among evangelists that the wound was healed in 1929? It comes from a publication from the San Francisco Chronicle. And there was an article explaining what happened on the date when this concordat was signed. The front page of the newspaper had this title in big lettering: Vatican again at peace with Italy after long quarrel. In smaller lettering, it said below the large title, Heal Wound of Many Years. And so, you see heal wound, you say immediately, Revelation chapter 13. Now, the part of the article that Adventists focus on is what we're going to read at the bottom of page 50. This was in the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. The Roman question tonight was a thing of the past, and the Vatican was at peace with Italy. The formal accomplishment of this today was the exchange of signatures in the historic palace of St. John Lateran by two noteworthy plenipotentiaries, Cardinal Gaspari for Pope Pius XI and Premier Mussolini for King Victor Emmanuel III. And now comes the key portion of this paragraph in the San Francisco Chronicle. In affixing the autographs to the memorial document, healing the wound. And you know what happens many times when this appears on PowerPoint in an evangelistic series? They put healing the wound, ... But they don't finish the statement. What does the statement say in its totality? In affixing the autographs to the memorial document, healing the wound which has festered since 1870. With which wound does this have to do? Not the 1798 one. 1798 one was resolved in 1801. Not totally and completely, but a new pope was elected and he was allowed to keep his Italian principality. So it says, it continues saying, which has been festered since 1870, extreme cordiality was displayed from both sides. You can read the statement from the New York Times, which describes this event. Don't get me wrong, what happened in 1929 was very significant. The recovery of temporal sovereignty by the papacy was very, very important for the role that it was going to play in the future. But the wound was not healed at that time. Now we need to ask the question, why hasn't the mortal wound healed yet? Once again, we'll take a Roman Catholic writer who's going to help us along. Malachi Martin. Listen to this penetrating statement. He doesn't have the foggiest idea that he's commenting on Revelation 13. But when we read Revelation 13 and what he wrote, we know that he's commenting precisely on that. Notice in 1986, this is about 200 years after the French Revolution, he says, for 1,500 years and more, Rome, he's talking about papal Rome, Rome had kept as strong a hand as possible in each local community around the wide world. So for 1,500 years and more, papal Rome had kept as strong a hand as possible in each local community around the wide world. And then he says this, by and large, and admitting some exceptions, that has been the Roman view. What has been the Roman view? The Roman view has been what? Keeping as strong a hand as possible in each local community around the wide world. But now notice what he continues saying. That was the Roman view until 200 years of inactivity. Would that be the same as being in prison? The deadly wound? Inactive. Until 200 years of inactivity. Who imposed the inactivity? Had been imposed upon the papacy by the major secular powers of the world. The stones will cry out, Jesus said. Now, if you go back from 1986, 200 years, do you know where you come to? The French Revolution that gave the papacy the deadly wound. So what is it that happened during the French Revolution, which culminates in the captivity of the Pope? What was it that happened back there? The major secular powers of the world imposed restrictions upon the papacy. Now, Ellen White concurred, and I read this one before. Ellen White explains, let the restraints now imposed by secular governments be removed, and Rome be reinstated in her former power, and there would speedily be a revival of her tyranny and persecution. So the reason why the deadly wound has not been healed is because the secular governments of the world have not allowed the papacy to ride on them again. So to speak, the chains that fell off the hands of the papacy when the secular power was removed have not yet been placed or taken off of the papacy. Now, I want you to notice what John W. Robbins had to say about the Roman Catholic Church. This is a very interesting statement. By the way, John W. Robbins is a Reformed theologian. This statement is not actually his. It is a statement by Ayn Rand back in 1967. And I want you to notice this interesting statement that he quotes in his book. The Catholic Church has never given up the hope to reestablish. What does that indicate? Reestablish. You can't reestablish something that wasn't established before. The Catholic Church has never given up the hope to reestablish the medieval union of church and state with a global state and a global theocracy as its ultimate goal. Is that what Francis I is talking about? You better believe it. The Roman church state is a hybrid, a monster of ecclesiastical and political power. Its political thought is totalitarian. And whenever it has had the opportunity to apply its principles, the result has been bloody repression. If during the last 30 years, remember she's writing in 1967, saying this in 1967, it's being quoted by Robbins later on, if during the last 30 years it has softened its assertion of full, supreme, and irresponsible power and has murdered fewer people than before, such changes in behavior are not due to a change in its ideas, but a change in its circumstances. What are the circumstances? It has what? A deadly wound. It is in prison. And then he makes this ominous statement. The Roman church state in the 20th century, however, is an institution recovering from a mortal wound. I don't think he's not thinking of Revelation 13, because he doesn't believe the papacy is the beast of Revelation 13, but he's using the language. So he says, the Roman church state in the 20th century, however, is an institution recovering from a mortal wound if and when it regains. In order to regain it, it must have what? Lost it. If it regains its power and authority, it will impose a regime more sinister than any the planet has yet seen. Reformed scholar, not an Adventist. He's got it straight. Many of our own people are saying, don't be hard on the papacy, you know. The papacy of today is not the papacy of the past. You better believe it isn't. It's worse. Now notice what Dave Hunt had to say. Why do world leaders want to get into bed with the Vatican? That gives the idea of fornication, doesn't it? The heads of state in today's world all recognize that the Pope wields a power that in many ways is even greater than their own. All you have to do is go to the United Nations and observe what the 193 representatives of nations did when the Pope gave his speech there on the agenda for the year 2030. Amazing. He continues saying, it is not only Catholicism's 900 million subjects and enormous wealth that caused the world's most powerful governments to cultivate friendly relations with the Roman Catholic Church. It is because Vatican City's citizens are found in great numbers in nearly every country. They constitute an international network that reaches into the inside circles of the world's power centers. Now, Malachi Martin wrote an interesting book, The Keys of This Blood. And basically, in that book, he describes the competition for world dominion between Western capitalism, communism, and the Roman Catholic papacy. It was a book that was published a long time ago, but Malachi Martin could see where things were trending. Notice what he wrote in this book on page 18. There was one great similarity shared by all three of these globalist competitors. The Pope, at that time it was Mikhail Gorbachev, and Western capitalism represented by the President of the United States. Each one has in mind a particular grand design for one world governance. Their geopolitical competition is about which of the three will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. Now, what is the time frame where this is going to be imposed? I think this book was written in 1989. On the last page, short statement here. As to the time factor involved, those of us who are under 70 will see at least the basic structures of the new world government installed. Those of us under 40 will surely live under its legislative, executive, and judiciary authority and control. Isn't that an amazing statement? And we see that this is happening more and more. So, did you understand Revelation chapter 13? I hope that it was clear, because there are many things that, that we say that need to be amplified, that need to be explained more fully, and there are some things that perhaps we've misunderstood. Now, in our next study together, we are going to take a look at the beast that rose from the earth.
Visit secretsunsealed.org for annual class dates and topics. Anchor is a seminary-level course of study on the fundamentals of Seventh-day Adventist theology taught by Pastor Stephen Bohr and guest theologians. Seating is limited.